every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. It begins, as it so often does, with a lie. Not a grand theatrical deception, but a small, simple falsehood. The kind of lie you tell to buy yourself an hour a day, a little more time, a lie born of convenience or perhaps of panic. But some lies don't fade. They put down roots. They grow, twisting and branching out until they create a shadow so vast it eclipses the sun, a shadow so dark it can hide the most unthinkable of truths. In the summer of 2008, in the sticky, oppressive heat of Orlando, Florida, such a shadow was growing, and at its center was a 2-year-old girl named Caylee Anthony. For 31 days, while a mother told stories of nannies and beach trips, a grandmother's worry festered into terror. That terror finally broke on July 15th, in the form of a frantic 911 call. On the recording, Cindy Anthony's voice is a blade of pure panic. "I have someone here that I need to be arrested," she tells the dispatcher. A moment later, she clarifies the real horror. "I have a 2-year-old granddaughter who has been missing for a month." And then, the sentence that would come to define the case, a sentence that captured the impossible, suffocating reality of the situation. "I found my daughter's car today, and it smells like there's been a dead body in the damn car." Welcome to Anatomy of Crime. The case of Caylee Anthony is not a story of whodunit. In the court of public opinion, a verdict was rendered almost immediately. Instead, this is a story of how a prosecution, armed with a mountain of circumstantial evidence, failed to convince 12 jurors. How a defense team, faced with a client despised by millions, managed to construct a fortress of doubt. Today, we are not dissecting the anatomy of a murder. We are dissecting the anatomy of an acquittal. We will explore the legal strategies, the courtroom maneuvers, and the precise methodical creation of reasonable doubt that allowed a woman the world called a monster to walk free. The timeline is critical to understanding the state's case. Caylee Marie Anthony was last seen alive by her grandparents, George and Cindy Anthony, on June 16, 2008. That afternoon, according to Casey, she took Caylee to a park and then to the nanny's apartment. From that moment on, the little girl was gone. But Caylee Anthony's life continued, not with the frantic panic of a concerned mother, but with an unnerving, almost celebratory normality. This 31-day period would become the bedrock of the prosecution's argument about her character and motive. Her boyfriend at the time, Tony Lazzaro, would later testify that their life during this month was completely normal. They went to video stores. They ordered takeout. They watched movies. Casey never mentioned Caylee was missing. She never seemed distressed. In fact, she seemed liberated. She told Tony and her friends that her daughter was with the nanny, Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez, Zanny, a woman no one had ever met. Sometimes Caylee was at the beach with Zanny. Other times she was at a theme park. The excuses were fluid, constant, and designed to keep anyone from asking too many questions. While her 2-year-old was supposedly missing, Casey was photographed at nightclubs, smiling, drinking, and participating in a hot body contest. She went on shopping sprees, buying clothes for herself. She got a new tattoo on her left shoulder blade. The Italian words, Bella Vita, meaning the good life. To the prosecution, these were not the actions of a grieving or terrified mother. They were the actions of a young woman who had shed a responsibility she no longer wanted. Meanwhile, her parents were growing increasingly desperate. Cindy Anthony would call Casey daily, begging to speak with Caylee. Casey would always have an excuse. The phone battery was dead. Kaylee was sleeping. They were at the pool. The lies became more elaborate, more specific, and ultimately more suspicious. Finally, after weeks of being put off, Cindy received a call from Casey on July 13th, saying she was at work at Universal Studios and would bring Kaylee home later. But she never came. The next day, July 14th, was a blank. No calls, no texts. On July 15th, Cindy received a call from the manager of a local tow yard. Her daughter's white Pontiac Sunfire had been impounded for 2 weeks. She and her husband George went to retrieve it. The moment George Anthony opened the car door, he recoiled. He would later testify that the odor was overwhelming, unmistakable. He had worked in law enforcement. He had smelled death before. This was it. Inside the car, they found a bag of trash. But the smell, he insisted, was something else entirely. It was a smell that had permeated the very fabric of the car. That was the moment the facade crumbled. Cindy Anthony's 911 calls that day are a portrait of dawning horror. In her first call, she is still trying to get her daughter arrested for stealing money, but the overwhelming stench from the car is her primary concern. In a subsequent call, the truth, as Casey had just revealed it to her, spills out. Casey hadn't seen Kaylee in 31 days, claiming a nanny had kidnapped her. It was the first time anyone, her parents, her friends, her boyfriend, had heard this story. When Orange County Sheriff's Deputy Yuri Melich arrived at the Anthony home, he was met with a 22-year-old mother who seemed, in his words, unconcerned. She was calm, almost detached, as she told her story about Zanny the nanny. She claimed she had been conducting her own investigation for a month, too scared to go to the police. She gave them a full name, an address, and a place of employment for this supposed nanny. Every single detail was a lie. The address led to an apartment that was vacant. The employment lead was a dead end. Then came the now infamous trip to Universal Studios. Casey, with detectives in tow, confidently led them through the theme park, greeting security guards, navigating the crowds like an employee. She took them to an office building, walked down a hall, and stopped in front of a random door. She swiped a non-existent key card. It was a piece of pure theater. After a long silence, she finally turned to the detectives and admitted it. She didn't work there. It was all a lie. Lie after lie collapsed under the slightest scrutiny. The investigators were not dealing with a frantic mother whose child had been abducted. They were dealing with a compulsive fabulist. The focus of the investigation quickly shifted from a missing child to a potential homicide, with the primary suspect being the child's own mother. On July 16th, Casey Anthony was arrested and charged with child neglect, making false official statements, and obstruction of a criminal investigation. The search for Kaylee intensified, becoming a national media event. Volunteers scoured the woods and swamps of Central Florida. The public was captivated and horrified. As the search for the little girl continued, the search for evidence against her mother yielded disturbing results. The trunk of the Pontiac Sunfire became a miniature crime scene. Investigators took carpeting, air samples, and collected debris. A forensics expert from the University of Tennessee, Dr. Arpad Vass, a specialist in the science of human decomposition, analyzed air samples from the trunk. His conclusion was damning. They contained chemical compounds, including high levels of chloroform, consistent with a decomposing human body. Another expert found a single strand of hair in the trunk. It was microscopically similar to hair from Kaylee's hairbrush, and it exhibited a dark band at the root, a phenomenon known as postmortem root banding, which can occur after death. Then came the digital forensics. Investigators analyzed the Anthony family's desktop computer. They found that someone had used the web browser to search Google for chloroform 84 times. In the weeks leading up to Kaylee's disappearance, there had been other searches: foolproof suffocation, neck breaking, how to make chloroform. The browser history also showed someone had visited a website advocating for the pro-choice position, on an article that discussed being pro-choice for the child-free. The public narrative was set. Casey Anthony, the party girl, the liar, had grown tired of being a mother. She had researched methods to kill her daughter, sedated her with chloroform, suffocated her with duct tape, stored her body in the trunk of her car for days, and then dumped it in the woods before going on with her life. It was a clear, simple, and monstrous story. The media branded her "Tot Mom," and she became the most hated woman in America. On October 14, 2008, a grand jury indicted Casey Anthony on charges of first-degree murder, aggravated child abuse, aggravated manslaughter of a child, and 4 counts of providing false information to law enforcement. The prosecution, led by Linda Drain Burdick and Jeff Ashton, announced they would seek the death penalty. Casey pleaded not guilty. The stage was set for one of the most sensational trials in modern American history. And then, on December 11, 2008, the search for Kaylee Anthony came to a tragic end. A utility worker named Roy Kronk, walking through a wooded, swampy area less than half a mile from the Anthony family home, noticed a plastic trash bag. He nudged it with his stick and saw what looked like a small human skull. He called the police. This was, in fact, the 3rd time Kronk had called authorities about something suspicious in that very location. His previous calls in August had been mishandled and not properly investigated. This detail would later become a crucial point of contention for the defense. Investigators waded through the mud and tangled undergrowth. They found the scattered skeletal remains of a small child, a Winnie the Pooh blanket, and a laundry bag, and wrapped around the skull, stuck to the matted hair, were strips of silver duct tape. Dental records confirmed the identity. It was Kaylee. After 5 months of desperate hope, the search was over. The murder trial could now begin. The trial began on May 24, 2011. Due to the intense media coverage in Orlando, jury selection had to be conducted across the state in Clearwater. It took nearly 2 weeks to find 12 jurors and several alternates who claimed they could be impartial. They were brought to Orlando and sequestered for the duration of the trial, cut off from all news and public opinion. The courtroom was a media circus. People lined up overnight to get one of the few public seats. It was broadcast live, and millions watched, convinced of the outcome. The prosecution had the lies, the behavior, the smell in the car, the hair, the chloroform evidence, the computer searches, and now they had a body with duct tape over the mouth. It seemed, to the outside world, like an open and shut case. But inside the courtroom, a different story was about to unfold. The defense, led by a charismatic but relatively unknown lawyer named Jose Baez, was preparing to go on the offensive, and he would start by telling a story so shocking, so unexpected, that it would change the entire trajectory of the trial. The prosecution's opening statement, delivered by Linda Drain Burdick, was methodical and straightforward. She laid out the timeline of lies. She told the jury how Casey Anthony had lived a carefree life while her daughter was missing. She spoke of the stench of death in the car trunk. She presented the state's theory. Casey used chloroform to render her daughter unconscious, then placed duct tape over her nose and mouth to suffocate her. The motive, a desire for freedom. A life, Burdick said, that did not include a 2-year-old child. It was the exact narrative the public had already accepted. It was logical, and it fit the evidence they had. Then, it was Jose Baez's turn. What happened next is now the stuff of legal legend. He stood before the jury and began not with a denial, but with an entirely new narrative. He admitted Casey had lied, but her lies, he argued, were not the calculated deceptions of a killer. They were the dysfunctional coping mechanism of a young woman who had been sexually abused by her father, George Anthony, since she was a child. The courtroom was stunned into silence. Baez went on. The lies were a fantasy world Casey had created to escape the trauma of her life, a trauma compounded by her brother Lee, who he alleged had also made advances on her. This was the first bombshell. The second was even more explosive. Baez looked at the jury and told them how Caylee Anthony really died. It was not a murder, he said. It was a tragic accident. On June 16, 2008, Caylee drowned in the family's above-ground swimming pool. Casey and her father, George, found her. George, Baez claimed, flew into a panic. He convinced Casey that she would be blamed, that she would spend the rest of her life in prison for child neglect. So he took charge. He told Casey he would take care of it. He disposed of the body himself. And for 31 days, Casey Anthony went into a bizarre psychological crisis, pretending her daughter was still alive because the truth, layered on top of a lifetime of abuse, was simply too much for her mind to handle. This was the anatomy of the defense strategy. It was a preemptive strike of breathtaking audacity. In one single opening statement, Baez provided the jury with an alternative explanation for everything. Casey's lies, the result of trauma, her partying and strange behavior, a psychological break. The smell in the car, George Anthony had put the body there before disposing of it. The computer searches, George did them. The duct tape, Baez suggested it was placed on the skeletal remains by George, long after death, perhaps in a misguided attempt to keep the jawbone attached. And crucially, Baez did something brilliant from a legal standpoint. He shifted the burden of proof. He didn't have to asterisk prove this story was true. He only had to make it plausible enough to create doubt about the prosecution's version of events. He put George Anthony, the prosecution's own witness, on trial. He turned the state's narrative of a sociopathic mother into a Gothic family tragedy of secrets, abuse, and dysfunction. The battle for reasonable doubt had begun. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The prosecution called a parade of witnesses and experts to build its circumstantial case, brick by brick. They began with Cindy and George Anthony. Cindy's testimony was emotional. She recounted the lies, the panic, the smell in the car. But on cross-examination, Baez's team began to poke holes. They highlighted inconsistencies in her statements. They suggested her memory was faulty. A key moment came when they questioned her about the chloroform computer searches. Cindy, trying to help her daughter, testified that she had been the one to search for chloroform, claiming she was looking up information on chlorophyll for her plants. It was a transparently weak explanation that damaged her credibility with the jury. George Anthony's testimony was the centerpiece of the trial's first act. On the stand, he tearfully denied the allegations of sexual abuse. He denied finding Caylee's body in the pool. He denied any role in a cover-up. But under a relentless cross-examination by defense attorney Cheney Mason, he was portrayed as a controlling, dishonest man. Mason grilled him about an affair he had hidden from his wife. He grilled him about a suicide note George wrote in January 2009, in which he said he felt the burden of guilt for Caylee. The defense framed this not as the grief of a grandfather, but as the guilt of a man who had covered up her death. They never proved he abused his daughter or disposed of his granddaughter's body, but they succeeded in painting him as a less than credible witness. They planted a seed of doubt. Next, the prosecution moved to its forensic evidence, the supposed scientific proof of Casey's guilt. This is where the defense's strategy of methodical deconstruction truly shone. For every piece of evidence the prosecution presented, Baez and his team had an expert or an argument ready to challenge it, muddy the waters, and create uncertainty. Let's dissect the smell in the trunk. The prosecution presented the air sample analysis from Dr. Arpad Vass. Dr. Vass was a pioneer in what is sometimes called olfactory forensics, the study of the unique chemical signature of death. He testified that the air in the trunk contained dozens of compounds specific to human decomposition, but the defense attacked the science itself. Dr. Vass's method was novel. It hadn't been widely accepted in courtrooms or extensively peer-reviewed. Baez brought in his own expert who testified that without a body, you cannot be 100% certain about the source of an odor. He argued the smell could have come from a bag of household trash, including meat scraps and pizza, that Casey admitted she left in the trunk for days. Was it the smell of a dead child or the smell of rotting garbage? The defense made it impossible to be sure. They created doubt. Then there was the hair from the trunk. The prosecution's expert, Karen Lowe, said it showed signs of post-mortem root banding. But on cross-examination, she had to concede that this type of banding had only been studied in hairs plucked directly from decomposing bodies. It had never been scientifically validated on a hair that had fallen out naturally and was later in the asterisk vicinity of a decomposing body. The defense argued the hair could have simply been one of Kaylee's that was already in the trunk from riding in the car, and the signs of decomposition came from proximity to the leaking bag of trash. The hair also had no DNA on the root, meaning they couldn't even be certain it was Kaylee's, only that it was microscopically similar to hers. They created doubt. The chloroform evidence was a major pillar of the state's case. The 84 Google searches were damning. The air sample tests showed high levels of chloroform in the trunk. The prosecution argued this was the murder weapon, but the defense systematically dismantled this pillar. First, the computer. They used forensic software to show that while Casey's user account was logged in during the time of the searches, another person was in the house and had used the computer just minutes before. They argued that anyone could have performed the searches. Cindy had already tried to take the fall for it. The defense implied George could have done it. They showed the jury that the prosecution couldn't definitively place Casey at the keyboard. Second, the chloroform in the trunk. The defense found a critical issue with the FBI laboratory that did the testing. The lab had also tested a sample known to contain chloroform on the same day they tested the sample from Casey's trunk, opening the possibility of cross-contamination. Furthermore, the expert who found the chloroform in the trunk carpeting couldn't say when or how it got there. He also noted under cross-examination that chloroform is a common environmental contaminant. The quantities found were small. It wasn't the smoking gun the prosecution believed it to be. They created doubt. Even the most visceral piece of evidence, the duct tape found on Kaylee's skull, was not immune. The prosecution argued it was the instrument of death, applied in 3 strips over the nose and mouth. Jeff Ashton held up a picture of the skull for the jury and said, "This is the face of a mother who didn't want to be a mother anymore." But the defense countered with their own expert, a world-renowned forensic pathologist named Dr. Werner Spitz. He testified that if the tape had been applied for suffocation, the body's soft tissues would have decomposed, leaving the tape loose. The fact that it was found stuck tightly to the skull and hair, he argued, meant it was more likely applied long after decomposition was complete, when only bone remained. He suggested it could have been applied to hold the jaw in place. It was a gruesome image, but it offered an alternative, non-homicidal explanation. The defense also focused on Roy Kronk, the meter reader who found the body. They painted him as a suspicious figure. Why had he called the police 3 times about that specific location? They suggested he might have found the body months earlier, moved it, and then rediscovered it to claim reward money. They even implied he might have placed the duct tape on the skull himself. There was no evidence for this, but the goal wasn't to prove it. The goal was to deflect suspicion from Casey and create another what if. They created doubt. For weeks this pattern repeated. The prosecution would present a fact, and the defense would reframe it, question its validity, or offer another possibility. They never had to prove their story of an accidental drowning and a cover-up. They only had to show that the state couldn't disprove it. They were not building a case for innocence. They were systematically demolishing the case for guilt. The prosecution, meanwhile, struggled with what it didn't have. They had no definitive cause of death. The medical examiner, Dr. Jan Garavaglia, could only rule it a homicide by undetermined means. This was a significant blow. Without a cause of death, the prosecution's theory of suffocation by duct tape was just that, a theory. They had no murder weapon. The chloroform theory was now riddled with doubt. They had no DNA evidence linking Casey Anthony to the duct tape or the disposal site. All they had was a collection of circumstantial evidence and a defendant who was a proven liar. But lying, as the defense repeatedly reminded the jury, is not a crime punishable by death. The defense's case was surprisingly short. They called only a handful of witnesses. Their most important work had already been done during the cross-examinations of the state's witnesses. They chose not to put Casey Anthony on the stand. A wise move, given her history of lying. Her story had already been told by Jose Baez in his opening statement, and putting her on the stand would have exposed her to a withering cross-examination from Jeff Ashton. In their closing arguments, the two sides presented their final, polished narratives. Prosecutor Jeff Ashton gave an emotional, powerful closing. He walked the jury through Casey's lies, her Bella Vita tattoo, gotten while her daughter was missing. He scoffed at the defense's drowning theory, calling it an absurd fantasy for which they had presented zero evidence. He pointed to the duct tape. There is no other plausible explanation for duct tape on a child's face, he said. He asked the jury to find Casey Anthony guilty of first-degree murder. Then Jose Baez gave his closing. He spoke for hours. He was calm, methodical. He didn't argue that Casey was a good person or a good mother. He argued that the prosecution's case was a fantasy of forensics. He projected a slide with a picture of a balance scale. On one side he put the prosecution's evidence. On the other, a single feather representing reasonable doubt. He went through every piece of evidence and reminded the jury of the doubts his team had raised. The smell, the hair, the chloroform, the computer searches, he called them threads of smoke, not pillars of proof. He argued that the state had failed to prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, how Kaylee died, where she died, or when she died. His entire closing argument was a masterclass in the anatomy of doubt. He gathered all the seeds of uncertainty he had planted throughout the trial and presented the jury with a garden of reasonable doubt. The case went to the jury on July 4, 2011. The nation waited, expecting a quick guilty verdict. Pundits and legal experts on television almost unanimously predicted a conviction for murder. But the 12 men and women in the jury room were not watching the news. They had been sequestered for 6 weeks. Their only exposure to the case was what they had seen and heard inside the courtroom. They had listened as José Baez and his team spent weeks methodically chipping away at the state's case. They had been presented with an alternative theory that, while shocking, explained away much of Casey's bizarre behavior. They had been told over and over about the high burden of proof required for a conviction. The deliberations were shockingly short. After less than 11 hours, the jury announced they had reached a verdict. On July 5, 2011, Casey Anthony, dressed in a lavender sweater, stood to hear her fate. The clerk read the verdicts. On the charge of first-degree murder, not guilty. On the charge of aggravated manslaughter of a child, not guilty. On the charge of aggravated child abuse, not guilty. A gasp went through the courtroom. Casey Anthony began to cry, her body shaking with relief. Her lawyers embraced. Across the room, the prosecution team sat stunned, their faces masks of disbelief. Outside the courthouse and across the country, the reaction was one of shock and outrage. The public, which had convicted Casey Anthony months, if not years earlier, could not comprehend the verdict. She was found guilty on 4 misdemeanor counts of providing false information to law enforcement, the lies she told in the first days of the investigation. For those, she was sentenced to 4 years in jail, but with credit for time already served and good behavior, she was released just days later. On July 17, 2011, Casey Anthony walked out of jail a free woman. The verdict in the trial of Casey Anthony remains one of the most controversial in American history. To many, it represents a catastrophic failure of the justice system. But the outcome was not a declaration of innocence. The verdict of not guilty does not mean the jury believed Casey Anthony's story. In later interviews, jurors confirmed this. One juror said, "I did not say she was innocent. I just said there was not enough evidence." Another stated flatly, "Our decision was based on the evidence and the law that was presented to us in the courtroom." They felt the prosecution had failed to connect the dots. They had a story, but they didn't have the proof. This is the central anatomy of this case. It is a stark lesson in the vast difference between moral certainty and legal proof. The prosecution presented a compelling narrative, but it was a narrative built on a chain of circumstantial evidence. The defense's job was not to prove Casey's innocence, but simply to break one link in that chain. And they broke several. They showed that the forensic science was not as certain as the state claimed. They showed that key witnesses had their own credibility issues, and they offered an alternative, however implausible it seemed to the outside world, that could not be definitively disproven by the evidence presented. José Baez constructed a defense that gave the jury a place to hang their doubts. The drowning theory, combined with the allegations of sexual abuse, provided a framework to understand Casey's pathological lying and her callous behavior. It wasn't that the jury had to believe it happened that way. They just had to concede that it could have. And if it could have, then the state's theory was not the only possible explanation. That is the definition of reasonable doubt. The outrage that followed was, in many ways, a reaction to the system itself, a system that prioritizes the prevention of wrongful conviction over the guarantee of a guilty verdict, even when the public is sure it knows the truth. In the end, 2 stories were told in that Florida courtroom. One was a story of a selfish mother who murdered her child to live a life of freedom. The other was a story of a tragic accident, a family secret, and a cover-up born of panic and trauma. The jury was asked to find the truth beyond a reasonable doubt, but in the end, all they were left with was the phantom of a story and the unshakable silence of a little girl who could never tell her own. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.